Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're looking into a topic that hits close to home for many, especially this time of year, sensory overload and autism during the holidays.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area and particularly relevant as we head into Thanksgiving.
Definitely. And to guide our deep dive, we have this blog post titled Sensory Overload, The Nightmare of Thanksgiving Dinner from the website Cheap ABA.
Oh, that title's pretty striking, and I think it really captures the experience many people with autism face this time of year.
I agree. It gets right to the point and it sort of makes you rethink the whole warm and fuzzy Thanksgiving image,
It
right?
does, and the blog post really breaks down the science behind it, explaining how each of the five senses can be affected.
Let's unpack that starting with sound.
Mm.
Imagine the typical Thanksgiving scene. You have all the dishes clanking, multiple conversations happening at once, maybe some music in the background.
Yeah, and for someone with autism, that's not just background noise. It's often processed differently in the brain, almost like each sound is competing for attention and creating a sense of overwhelm. So it's not simply about things being too loud, it's more about how those sounds are actually perceived and filtered.
Exactly. Something that might be a pleasant hum for one person could be incredibly distracting for someone else.
That makes the Thanksgiving dinner scenario even more vivid. Then there's the visual aspect, too.
Oh, right. Think about the bright lights, the flashing decorations, people constantly moving around.
It's a lot of visual input.
Yeah.
And for someone with autism who might be sensitive to visual stimuli, that can be really challenging.
Absolutely. For some, it can be incredibly distracting, even anxiety-inducing.
Like trying to focus in a busy coffee shop, but amplified tenfold. And then you add in the sense of smell, which is such a big part of Thanksgiving.
Right. All those delicious aromas, but also a potential trigger for someone with a heightened sense of smell.
So instead of enjoying the blend of spices, it's more like being bombarded by individual scents, each vying for attention.
Exactly. And we often forget how powerful smell can be.
For sure. And then there's touch. The blog post mentions hugs, crowded spaces, even textures in certain foods.
It all comes down to tactile sensitivity. Think about how annoying it can be when a tag on your shirt is itchy.
I know that feeling.
Now amplify that and imagine that sensation with every hug or every time you brush past someone in a crowded room.
That puts it into perspective. And finally, Taste the blog post points out how Thanksgiving dishes with their mixed textures and flavors can be a lot to handle.
It's that heightened sensitivity again. A complex mix of flavors or textures can be overwhelming for some individuals with autism.
So instead of experiencing the overall flavor, each element might be perceived individually, almost competing on the palate.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've covered all five senses and how they play into the sensory overload of Thanksgiving. But this isn't just about autism, is it? Haven't we all felt overwhelmed by sensory input at some point? Maybe at a concert or in a crowded market?
Oh, absolutely. We all have sensory preferences and thresholds. It's about recognizing that we experience the world differently, and that's okay.
It's a good reminder that we're all on a spectrum when it comes to sensory experiences.
Exactly. And that brings us to the practical advice the blog post offers for creating a sensory-friendly Thanksgiving.
I'm interested to see what they suggest. Let's dive into that next.
Okay, so the blog post gives some really practical tips for actually creating a more sensory-friendly Thanksgiving experience.
Which is what we need, right? It's one
Yeah.
thing to understand the why, but it's even more helpful to have those actionable steps.
Exactly. And, it doesn't have to be this huge, overwhelming change.
Right. Like you don't need to completely reinvent Thanksgiving.
Yeah, it's more about a few small adjustments and being mindful of different needs.
I like that. So where do we start? The post mentions creating a sensory-friendly environment.
Right. So think about the visual aspect first. Instead of bright overhead lighting, maybe use lamps or dimmer switches.
Ah, so create a softer, more calming atmosphere.
Exactly, like the difference between a brightly lit grocery store and a cozy restaurant.
Oh, I get it. And what about noise? Thanksgiving's always a bit lively. Is there a way to manage that without killing the fun?
They suggest having a quiet zone.
Okay. A separate room.
It could be a separate room or even just a corner of a room that's intentionally less stimulating.
Like a sensory escape hatch.
You got it. Just a comfy chair, some soft lighting, maybe some calming activities.
I love that. And it avoids singling anyone out. It's just available to anyone who needs it.
Exactly. And speaking of calming, what about smell? Thanksgiving aromas are amazing, but they can be intense.
Yeah. Any advice for navigating that?
The post suggests being mindful of strong scents. So maybe skip the scented candles and air fresheners.
Oh, yeah. Especially those artificial ones.
Right. Let natural cooking smells be the star, or use unscented candles.
That makes a lot of sense. And while we're on the topic of being mindful, what about sensory breaks?
It's about normalizing the need to step away and making sure guests feel comfortable doing so.
Okay, so how do we do that?
You could casually mention the quiet zone, or even just encourage people to take a walk outside if the weather's nice.
That way it's not directed at anyone specifically.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of self-care.
And then there's the food, which is kind of the heart of Thanksgiving.
Right. The blog post suggests offering sensory-friendly food options.
That's a great idea. So not replacing the traditional stuff, but just having some alternative.
Yeah, like instead of a casserole with a lot of mixed textures, you could offer those same ingredients, but serve separately.
Ah, so people can choose what they're comfortable with.
Exactly. And having some lighter, less intensely flavored options, too.
Like a veggie platter or some fruit.
Perfect. And speaking of options, communication is key.
Right. How do we talk about sensory needs without making it awkward?
You could even mention it in the invitation. Just something like, we want everyone to feel comfortable. Please let us know if you have any dietary or sensory preferences.
So set the tone from the start.
And then, during the gathering, just be observant and check in with people.
Just a simple, how are you doing? Is everything okay?
Yeah. And be open to feedback. If someone wants to dim the lights or turn down the music, be receptive.
It's all about respect and understanding. And honestly, these tips aren't just for people with autism. They can benefit anyone who's sensitive to sensory input.
I agree. It makes for a more enjoyable experience for everyone.
So, creating a sensory-friendly Thanksgiving isn't about a huge overhaul. It's the little things that make a difference.
Exactly. Small adjustments, thoughtful communication, and a genuine desire to make everyone feel comfortable.
I love that. It's a reminder that simple gestures can have a big impact. And these tips go beyond just Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. They apply to any gathering or social situation.
We've talked about the sensory challenges of Thanksgiving and some solutions, but I feel like there's a bigger message here.
I think so too.
Yeah.
This idea of sensory awareness goes beyond one holiday.
It's something we can all benefit from and incorporate into our daily lives.
I agree. And that's something I think we should explore a bit more.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered just by looking at this one blog post about Thanksgiving.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It really opens up a whole new way of thinking about how we design and experience the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious, what are your final thoughts on this idea of sensory awareness? What's the big takeaway here?
For me, it's that sensory awareness isn't just about autism or any specific diagnosis. It's something we can all benefit from.
Right. Like it's about understanding that everyone experiences the world a little differently.
Exactly. And once we grasp that, we can start creating more inclusive and welcoming environments for everyone.
I love that. So it's not just about accommodating differences, but about designing for diversity from the start.
Exactly. And, it goes beyond just physical spaces, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about how we communicate, how we plan events, even how we interact with each other online.
Mm,
There are so many opportunities to be more mindful of sensory preferences.
that's such a good point. Like a whole new lens to view the world through.
It is. And the best part is it doesn't require some big, complicated overhaul.
Right. It's often the small things that make the biggest difference.
Absolutely. Like simply asking, is everything okay? Or being willing to adjust the lighting or music.
It's about being observant, being receptive to feedback, and ultimately just caring about how others feel.
Exactly. And you know what? I think cultivating that kind of empathy and awareness ultimately benefits everyone.
I completely agree. It makes for richer, more meaningful interactions and a more harmonious world overall.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into sensory awareness.
We hope you found it insightful.
If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out the Cheap ABA website for some fantastic resources.
They have some great stuff on there.
Until next time, happy exploring.